Josh, let us turn now to the subject we originally invited you in to discuss, which is the plummeting birth rate, the challenges it faces, how to encourage more people to have children. But also, this is a debate which seems to me to being led on the right of British politics about the depopulation and kind of various, I suppose, odd bedfellows getting into bed and not producing children, but a lot of kind of rhetoric about the situation.
Yeah, and I think that's bizarre. I think it's a problem for the substance of the debate that the people who seem to be driving it are essentially saying that the reason why low birth rates are a problem is that we have to rely on migration, and if only we had more babies, we wouldn't need to have migration. And that is an old... Anyone who's read any 19th century history knows that the basic idea of eugenics was we need the right kind of people. And that's what they seem to be saying. And not only is that morally wrong, it's also a complete misunderstanding of why our birth rates are low and what we actually need to do to increase them.
This is the kind of great replacement theory, right?
Yeah.
Which means we want more white babies. We don't want foreign babies.
And we need, trad wives milking cows in the kitchen and staying at home to look after 7 children. And if only people held on to those traditional family values, we'd have loads of babies.
Let's play you a clip. This is Nigel Farage in conversation with Jordan Peterson. And I'm interested to know what bit you would disagree with him.
What underpins everything is our Judeo-Christian culture. And that's where we need to start. That's where we need to start. We need some very, very big cultural changes. We've got to get that spirit, that sense of optimism back in the country. We had it in the late 1980s. We actually had it through much of the 1990s. That's what we have to recapture. And frankly, being led as we are God, doesn't Rachel Reeves just make you want to reach for the cry tissues? It's all so miserable. It's all so declinist. Frankly, the Conservatives have been no better.
What do you disagree with in terms of what you've heard from Nigel Farage there? Is he right when he says you need optimism, you need to encourage people to feel like they can have children in this country, that it's not all going to be really hard slog at work?
Of course we need optimism. The bit I disagree with, in plain terms, is the idea that, quote unquote, it all goes back to Judeo-Christian culture. It's just a profound misunderstanding of modern Britain. Of course, in our history, Judeo-Christian culture was crucial. We are still a Christian state. But what Farage essentially does in that clip you just played is segues from a statement about Christianity and whiteness and what it means to really be British or even English into something that I do agree with, which is we need more optimism, and we need, in some sense, a cultural shift around parenting and what it means to have kids and birth, and also to some extent sex and relationships. And those two things, you don't need the former to have the latter. And in fact, it's very, very dangerous to bleed the two, because it kind of implies that you can't have optimism about the future without going back to some sort of protected Judeo-Christian culture. And that's mad. I stood on a manifesto that was called Change. I believe in change. I believe in hope. I believe in optimism. And I embrace change. And I think we all should. And I do think we have a problem with a risk aversion, a sense that somehow our country's sort of destined for decline and we all should sort of hunker down in our houses.
Why do you think we're not having more children then?
The most simple reason is that the attitudes to parenting place this burden on parents, particularly women, that they have to spend an extortionate amount of time and money with their kids that make it seem like an enormous hurdle to have children. And if you look at the sort of demographic statistics and data on this across different countries, the only country really whose birth rate has stayed higher is France, where the average number of so-called intensive parenting hours, that's the sort of amount of time that a parent spends doing homework or talking directly to their child, has not gone up. And I read this statistic the other day and it blew me away. Working mums now spend more time on average per day with their children than stay-at-home mums did 10 years ago.
Yeah.
That tells you something quite profound about what we think parenting requires. And if you're, it's women in their 20s where birth rates have gone down the fastest, Well, if you're a woman in your 20s and you think your child needs 4.5 hours every single day of your time in order to be happy and fulfilled, that sounds like a pretty big burden, but they don't. I've got kids, I love my kids, and I try to spend as much time as I can with them, but kids do not need that kind of time. And I think
is that a guilt thing?
So hang on, so are you saying that we obsess too much about our children now, and they should be left to not fend for themselves exactly, but that they can get on with things much more, and we don't need to be tiger mums and tiger dads?
It's not that we care too much about our children. I know you used obsess rather than care, but I love kids, and I think family is fundamental, and I think we should celebrate children and parenting and family and talk about it more. But that is not the same as thinking that for a child to be successful and happy, they need 3 to 4 hours of my time unfocused in order to be that. My wife comes from 2 big families with 5-6 kids or more, and both sets of parents would see the kids for brief moments when they came in from playing on the street or whatever else they were doing, and they are perfectly healthy, happy, balanced adults. So it's not about celebrating children, parenting, motherhood, fatherhood any less. It's about not placing the burden on ourselves and the expectation that for our kids to be happy, we need to spend loads of time with them.
So Josh, you are making this argument about that this is something that needs to be addressed. You are a parliamentarian. Is this something that government can do anything about? I remember being in Singapore once with the Singaporean Prime Minister, and he was being challenged about the government policies to get Singaporeans to have more children, and it wasn't working particularly.
It's hard, and there is a lot of evidence that policy interventions that you think might help, even paying people to have babies, as I think they've done in Singapore through tax breaks, doesn't make that much difference to the birth rate. So I fully accept the challenge that the obvious tools are not that effective so far at boosting birth rates, and that's partly why I'm here. I think we have to talk about this more and talk about what family is, what sex is, what relationships is, how you go through your 20s, what a good life looks like in your 30s and beyond. And I think that's a massive part of how we change culture, and we get a bit too wonky a little bit too quickly in this discussion, I think. And I think we should do things on childcare and other things that make life easier for parents.
So there's no government lever you can pull and suddenly
Are you sure about that? I mean, there will be people screaming at the 3 of us now and saying, if you just gave us 4 or 5 hours paid for childcare a day, believe me, you would see the birth rate rise. You don't believe that?
I'm screaming at myself. Believe me, the prospect of having that sounds would be transformational for me and my wife, who both work and who struggle weekly with our schedule. But the evidence is that some of those things, they are good things to do for other reasons, like growth, like celebrating the fact that parenting is a positive, enriching thing, not an exhausting and expensive thing. So there's lots of reasons to do it. But if you're just focused on boosting the birth rate, that, so far it hasn't made much difference. So I do think that we should do that. And, the government has been clear. There's a review of parental leave going on at the moment. But I don't think we should do it only because we're interested in increasing birth rates. Actually, the birth rates challenge seems to be as much about culture and technology and so on.
Go on.
As about
I mean, that's interesting because, we work, with a lot of a young team who've kind of, for various reasons, decided children aren't for them. And you think it goes back to technology or culture or?
I do, yeah. I think there's no one cause of these things, but I think the way that technology affects culture and culture affects technology, and that shapes what we value fundamentally, I think is a big part of it. I mean, dating now in a city, even not in a city, but is pretty miserable. It's very, very dependent on social media and technology. The public spaces that we have to come together and meet people and have conversations have diminished over time. And what that means is that you're encouraged to think of yourself as a 20-year-old, as a sort of lone agent moving through the world. You're free, you're pushing at your career, you're, trying to desperately get on the housing ladder and probably failing. Having kids and getting married looks like a massive constraint on your freedom at that point. That's what it looks like. And that's how we talk about it. And that's how it's commonly presented in things that we watch. But we shouldn't think of it in that way. And we should do things in policy that reduce that barrier. But we should also sort of talk about how relationships, love, bringing up children is the most enriching and rewarding way you can possibly spend time. And yeah, for sure it means, you can go to the cinema less, go to the pub less when you want to. But what it means to live well is so much about doing that. And we've sort of stopped talking about that, or at least we've left talking about that to people who believe fundamentally in, replacing non-white people with white people, and that seems to me mad. We should talk about what it means to live well in that period of your life.
You going back to that clip of Farage, and you said that the thing you objected to was his use of the phrase Judeo-Christian, but you said that was rooted in the history of this country, of Judeo-Christian values. Is it so wrong to say something like that?
I don't believe in a politics where we call each other out and denounce and this, that and the other, so it's not objectionable, it's just wrong. The idea that the way you get hope and optimism and energy is to then cling on desperately to a Christian past in this country just seems to me a mad way to think about the future. We live in a world now that is diverse, that is involves technology everywhere in our lives, that exposes us to cultures outside of the UK as well. It's a lot of what our kids watch is American stuff as well as British stuff. And we should talk about how to achieve change in that world, not think that change will come from actually clinging on to something that's in the past. So it's more that there's a fundamental tension and conflict in what he's saying. I don't think it makes sense, than in some way I find it sort of objectionable and offensive.
It does seem that we've kind of gone full circle. I mean, we've grown up in a world where it felt there were too many people, right? That the story we've always told ourselves is, overcrowding, people draining natural resources, climate change, it's a massive problem, that all the big problems in the world were basically caused by there being too many people. And now we're looking at this absolutely kind of knife-edge drop. I mean, maybe that is the correction that we need to continue as a smaller number of people.
And I think sort of aggregate, trying to sit here in London and think that we can pull all these levers and shape how people have relationships and babies, and we can boost the birth rate here, and that isn't how
you can't do it.
You can't do it. It's not how change happens, and it's not even desirable in a way. I don't want to tell people exactly when they should have babies. Part of what I think the role of people like me is to share their experience of it and talk about it in a way that reflects the reality of it. When was the last time you really heard a politician talk about how exhausting but completely and utterly emotionally enriching parenting is? And to say, look, I miss my pub trips with my mates a bit. Would I trade a night with my kids for that? Any day of the week. And I think that, we have, if we talk about that more and we communicate with each other about what that looks like, what we need to get out of that is a sense that parenting is not something that you sort of do in a street on your own inside your house in isolation. It's a social thing. It's about people coming together. It's about community. And we have, I think...
I mean, that's the difference, isn't it? That when we were growing up, we had carpools for everything, So one person took 5 kids in the morning or whatever. We had babysitting clubs where one of the neighbours...
Does that not exist now?
I think it doesn't. I don't think it does, really.
Not in the same way. Not in the same way. And I
mean, the sense of neighbourhood was really, really strong. That whole sense of... one mother would cook for 5 kids, which was all the neighbours' kids on any day of the week, right? I don't think that happens.
The place side of it is so important. It's fascinating because as a newly elected MP, we now have to, I've got 2 kids younger than school age. So we as a family unit moved back and forth between Wigan and London a lot. And in Wigan, there is still much more of that sort of place-based neighbourhood. We can help each other bring up kids together. And in London, my God, people on the street just don't talk to each other. It's sort of...
It's just much harder, isn't it?
Maybe this isn't true everywhere, but the transience of it makes it... And the irony there is that lots of people in their 20s live in cities, in exactly the places where it's really difficult to be rooted enough and to know your neighbours and the people on your street enough to sort of socialise. Parenting has only been nuclear very recently. It used to be a social thing, and we have to work out how to make it more of a social thing again for it to be something that's fun.
And that's also about extended families as well, isn't it? I mean, the fact that you've married an American, presumably her family are in the US, unable to help. I've got a son with 2 small children in Australia. There's only so much grandparenting help you can give from 10,000 miles away. So I think that's part of it as well. Can I ask you a very personal question?
I may not answer it, but you can.
Well, how many kids are you going to have? You're saying that people should have more children. Is it an unfair question of me to say, well, you've got 2, I think. Is that right?
We've got 2. Yeah, we've got 2 kids. They are both under school age. So life's pretty intense right now. The honest answer to that is it's basically up to my wife. She's in the driving seat in all manner of ways, and the number of children we have is largely her call. Because, although we try as hard as possible to share the burden of parenting, and I've been part of this campaign called the Dad Shift campaign, which talks about fatherhood a lot more. I'm hosting a event in my constituency which is specifically aimed at getting dads to come and talk about the challenges of being a working class dad. But in the end, it's my wife who has to face the sort of guilt that comes from not spending 4 hours a day with her kids, or teaching them Spanish and piano and swimming and everything else. And therefore, I think that, it should largely be up to her to decide how many we have.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.